Plot summary of Big Fish by Daniel Wallace. William Bloom talks about the last trip he took with his father, Edward Bloom, in the car. They stop by a river, where Edward wades in and thinks about his childhood. William thinks of Edward as a wild creature who is both young and old, and Edward becomes a legend. William starts to tell the story of how his dad lived. Edward is born in Ashland, Alabama, during a drought at the same time that a huge storm breaks out. As a child, Edward has always been good with animals. He seems to be able to talk to them, and they seem to follow him around. When Edward is 9, a big snowstorm hits Alabama and covers everything up, including his house. On his way to school, he sleeps in a tree and passes a man who is frozen in a block of ice. Edward grows so fast that his bones can't keep up. For a while, he has to stay in bed. He uses the time to read every book in his town. William thinks Edward is a big fish already. William skips ahead in time to talk about how his father died. The trusted family doctor, Dr. Bennett, comes out of the guest room and says he can't help. Edward has been sick for a while, so William and his mother, Sandra, were ready for this. William says that Edward was a nomadic father who traveled a lot for work and stopped at home between his trips. Every time he went home, Edward got upset quickly and always longed to be back on the road. Back in the present, William goes into the guest room, and Edward says he's sorry he missed so much of William's life. Edward says that he wanted to be a great man, a big fish in a big pond. William stops Edward from talking about a woman with 2 heads because he doesn't want to hear about her again. Edward jokes that he's really talking about the 2-headed lady's sister, and William is immediately interested in the story. William goes back to talking about Edward's childhood. One day, Edward is relaxing by the river when he sees a beautiful river girl taking a bath in the water. Edward jumps into the water to grab a snake that is swimming towards her. Edward turns around so the river girl can put on her clothes, but when he turns back, she's gone. Even though the snake is now a stick, it still seems to swim away. Carl the Giant is one of William's favorite stories about Edward's childhood. Carl is a young boy who is big and strong and has a huge appetite. Carl moves to Ashland when he is 14 and starts eating everything he sees. Edward goes to find Carl to help solve the problem. Carl starts out scary, but soon he starts to cry and says he's always hungry. Edward promises to teach Carl how to cook and farm so that Carl won't have to steal from other people. Carl ends up becoming one of the most successful farmers in Ashland. One day, a flood in Ashland covers half of the town with a lake where people say giant catfish swim. Edward tries to catch one of these catfish by fishing and ends up going under. Edward sees all the people whose homes were flooded going about their normal lives. As they talk, little air bubbles come out of their mouths. Edward decides to leave town when he is 17. He must first go through the place with no name, where a lot of people get stuck and can't move on. As Edward gets closer to the town, the weather starts to look very bad. It is a barren place where people with missing fingers and missing parts of their faces wander around looking lost. Edward is met by an old man named Wiley, who shows him around. Edward notices that the air is damp. Wiley tells him that the dampness is left over from people's dreams that they have forgotten. Dog, a fierce dog, comes out of nowhere and runs towards Edward. Wiley says that Dog is like a gatekeeper and tells Edward, who is scared, to put his hand out. The dog stops growling and instead licks Edward's hand. Wiley looks sad, but he takes Edward to the Good Food Cafe in a hurry. A man even older than Wiley tells Edward not to face Dog again, and people start crowding around Edward to tell him to stay. They suddenly moved back because Dog was coming. Dog jumps over Edward, and Edward runs out of the place with no name. The sky gets brighter, and Edward and Dog start to run together. When they get to a lake, Dog gives Edward a warm kiss and then lays down. Edward sees the river girl waving to him from afar. Jasper Bloom, who works with Edward, tells the next part of the story. That night, Two bad guys rob, beat, and leave Edward for dead, but he keeps walking, ready for whatever comes next. When Edward goes to a country store run by an old man named Jim Benson, he gets help from a doctor. Edward doesn't want to ask for help, so he grabs a broom and starts sweeping the floor, dragging his broken leg behind him. Edward passes out, and the Benson family gathers around him. He briefly wakes up and says, "Advertise." Edward stays with the Bensons for a while and is able to turn their failing store into a success thanks to his clever advertising. William goes back to telling the story and says that Edward has decided to attend college in Auburn. When Edward meets an old woman, she tells him that some boys took her glass eye. Edward promises to give it back to the woman. Edward finds the boys sitting around the glass eye in an old barn. Edward talks them into giving him the eye, but the leader of the gang warns him that if he doesn't give it back in the morning, they'll cut out his eyes. Edward is scared and doesn't sleep all night because he doesn't know what to do. The next morning, Edward goes back to the barn with the old woman, who is now wearing the eye. She looks at each boy in turn, and they all run away because they are scared. Edward starts to study, and the other boys don't bother him anymore. William skips again to the time when Edward dies. William asks Edward, "Do you believe in God?" in the guest room. Edward laughs it off with a joke. William is angry. All he wants is for Edward to tell him the truth for once. Edward says he doesn't know what he thinks about God, and he'd rather tell a joke than a bunch of doubts because at least jokes make people laugh. William goes back to telling the story of Edward's life. He now talks about Edward's relationship with Sandra. Dawn Price, the leader of the gang, even asks Sandra out on a date, but she still goes out with Edward. Edward makes Sandra fall in love with him by just being himself. Dawn Price goes after Edward and Sandra one night and finds them. Edward tries to calm Dawn down, but Dawn won't listen. Instead, he fights Edward. Dawn loses the fight, and Sandra kisses Edward, making it official that they are going to be together. Edward and Sandra run away together and visit Sandra's old parents before moving to Alabama. In Alabama, Edward will have to do 3 labors. His first job is to clean out animal cages at a vet's office. His second job is as a lingerie clerk in a department store, where he has to convince a customer named Muriel Rainwater that men can be good lingerie assistants. His third task is to get rid of a wild hell dog that is causing trouble in the town. One night, Edward sees a little girl named Jennifer Morgan wander into the dog's path. He steps between them and kills the dog by pulling out its heart with his bare hands. Edward then joins the Navy during the war, and a torpedo hits the ship he is on. He comes close to drowning, but the river girl saves him. William skips to Edward's death and tells the story for the 3rd time. William begs Edward to tell him just one true story about his childhood. Edward tells him that his stories are metaphors and then tells him another joke, which makes William leave the room in anger. William goes back to telling the story of Edward's life around the time he was born. Edward is in love with William and makes a list of all the good things he wants William to have. Edward teaches William how to play catch and takes him on picnics, but he soon leaves William and Sandra for the excitement of the road, even though he loves them both. Edward comes back to William's life in a cameo role and saves his life twice. One day, Edward goes up to the roof to see the view, but he slips and falls. Edward pretends to be dead as a joke, and William thinks that this is how Edward wants to be remembered, as a man who makes people laugh. William agrees that Edward's best skill is making him laugh. Edward has a dream not long before he dies. In it, people camp out in tents outside the house like they are pilgrims. William goes outside to ask them to leave, and an old man tells him that they came to thank Edward for all the things he did for them, like lending them money and making them laugh. William finally gets it and goes back inside the house, telling a joke as he does so. When Edward is about 40 years old, William tells about another event in his life. Edward has a lot of success, but things at home are getting worse. Edward and Sandra even think about splitting up, but they decide to stay together in the end. During this time, Edward buys Spectre, a whole town. There, Edward meets Jenny Hill, a young girl, and the two of them fall in love. Edward only comes to see Jenny every once in a while, and Jenny spends her whole life waiting for him at the window. Her house is surrounded by a swamp, and soon no one can see anything but Jenny's yellow eyes shining from deep in the swamp. Soon after that, Edward goes home and tells his family that he has cancer. He moves into the guest room and starts swimming every day. As Edward's health gets worse, the swimming pool fills up with water. One day, Edward has a stroke, and William prays that Edward will wake up and tell one more joke. William tells the story of how his father died for the fourth and last time. In the hospital, Edward needs help to stay alive. William is thinking about one of his father's favorite jokes, which is about a man who buys a suit that is too big for him. Edward can tell the joke better than William can, though. William starts to cry out of nowhere. Edward wakes up briefly and says that he worries about William and that he tried to be a good father and teach William things. William tells Edward not to worry, and as Edward closes his eyes, he tells Edward the joke about the man in the suit again. Edward smiles and winks at her. William sneaks Edward out of the hospital, and as they drive to the river, Edward gurgles and pours water on himself. William takes Edward to the edge of the water, and all of a sudden, Edward turns into a fish. Edward is full of life as he swims away into the distance.
About the author. Daniel Wallace and his three sisters lived in Birmingham, Alabama, when they were young.
He went to Emory University in Boston to study English and philosophy, but he eventually quit to work for his father's trading company in Nagoya, Japan. He quit because he wasn't good at the job and wanted to write instead, but sometimes he jokes that his father fired him. Wallace and his wife moved to North Carolina, where he worked in a bookstore and wrote books at the same time. Wallace started writing because he likes the pure pleasure of invention. He says he didn't have a formal education at the time, so he taught himself how to write by trying to write. Before his sixth book, Big Fish, was accepted for publication in 1998, he wrote 5 books that publishers turned down. It was praised by many critics and has since been translated into 18 languages. Wallace went back to school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and graduated in 2008, even though he was still writing. He lives with his wife and son in North Carolina and teaches English at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also writes books. The Kings and Queens of Rome, his 8th book, came out in 2013.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.